Stories matter. Many stories matter.
So she said, "Oh, what are you?" So I said, "I'm a Camisa African." She said,
Children are not human becomings. They are human beings also.
Yeah.
And they have a contribution
what I also
to make.
came to learn around, the reality of us living in a world where there are actually different wisdoms.
I think even growing
we
up,
just
there's this
happened-
Afrikaans rhetorical question. Hou jy vir jou wit?
But this child was
Like
playing
that's-
against this one
that's the one
girl
that's-
from a very wealthy school. And she started losing the girl from the wealthy school.
That
And she
very
started
thin
tears
space
running
between life and
down
death
his
is what this is about.
Moses
But then he coined this phrase.
I don't know how to say that.
Is something
But his own personal story is one that I resonate with a lot. And I
An
think it
elder
has
in the
linked
community
to
stops them and says, "No, the burning of the cedar wood is the prayer. The thing is the prayer."
But in any case, fast forward to a couple of months down the line.
Welcome to episode 7 of the Liminal Space podcast. This is Tristan.
And this is Rashid.
And it's just the two of us recording today.
Yep.
This is a special, surprise, super duper secret bonus episode. But we thought, as we reflected on finishing season 1 of the Liminal Space podcast, we realized how much we had learned in our personal capacities. And we thought it'd be cool to share what some of those things were.
Yeah.
Some of our own processing. To begin, do you remember where we started? How we started even the Liminal Space podcast? To
Yes,
begin with?
yeah. It's quite an interesting story to share. So I remember probably quite soon after we met a couple of years ago, I was at your house.
Yeah.
I think the first time I was there. And then you guys have this upstairs loft kind of a space. Yeah. And I think you told me, yo, bro, I'd love to do like a podcast or something here, or have some sort of things like that.
Yeah.
And I was like, yeah, this is a beautiful space for that. Just get some sound vibes done and then you're good to go.
Yeah.
And then it's been like a few years since then.
Yeah, nothing happened in between.
Even didn't COVID even happen in between and stuff? Or did I meet you after COVID?
I think we met before COVID, but you'd have come to my house after
Maybe
COVID.
Okay, yeah. Fair enough. But yeah, nothing really happened in between. But I've always had this idea that, nah, man, Tristan must do this podcast thing because you're really great. And your voice, you have such a nice podcast voice as well. So I've had that in my mind. And I have maybe every now and then, every few months, I've bugged you. Yo, bro, you're going to do the podcast. What's the vibe? And then last year, probably over a year ago, I think it was around June, July last year. To be honest, I saw on Take a Lot like a 2-for-1 special on really nice microphones. And I'm always researching microphones because I do music and that kind of thing. And they were specifically podcast microphones. So I just bought them and then I sent you a picture. And I was like, bro, here's some microphones.
Yeah.
I'll record the podcast for you. What's the vibe?
And I said no, I don't.
Yeah.
I said no. Because when I had the idea to do a podcast, it wasn't like there was any specific idea.
Okay.
I just thought it'd be cool to do a podcast. Sometimes you have these thoughts and conversations with people and you think, wow, that's really cool. And actually, I'd never thought about doing a podcast myself. It was always like a group thing. It was going to be a conversation with a bunch of people.
Yes.
And then when you said, here's the podcast mics, etc., I was like, nah, not now is definitely not the time that I want to be doing a podcast.
Yeah.
But then that initial no was followed by a whole series of conversations on long walks.
Yeah. All around the city.
All around the city.
Yeah.
And I think your mind started changing as well about whether you were going to just record the episodes or you're actually going to be in the episodes themselves.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Because initially, exactly the thing from my side was I was saying, hey, bro, I'll record the thing for you.
Yeah.
And then part of the conversations that we had on our walks in different beautiful places around the city was we were talking about what about storytelling.
Yes.
And there's this thing that a mutual friend of ours, I haven't seen him in like a decade, but Patrick.
Yeah.
Shout out Patrick.
Yeah, one of our listeners.
Shout out Patrick. He had posted a short story that he wrote on Substack. And there were some lines in there which really just stuck with me. I read it a while back. But he said, telling stories for our people. And I just remember sitting with that and thinking about, I guess, the value of stories. And like we said, I mean, I remember saying in episode 1, we don't take ourselves too seriously.
Yeah.
We're not trying to be experts and trying to, save the city or whatever, as if we could ever do anything like that. But just leaning into, I guess, the value of storytelling and of wanting to listen to stories in our city. Perhaps, I guess, the part of recording, maybe there's an aspect to that, that's sharing stories as well in our city.
Yeah, that made me more comfortable with the idea of recording, because my discomfort was in being self-indulgent. we always joke about that.
Self-indulgence,
the self-indulgence of me saying some kind of view that people must believe or something, or convincing people or something like that. I'm not sure about that because I'm so unsure of myself. But the idea of telling stories and telling other people's stories, or giving exposure to stories that don't usually get exposure to, that was a lot more attractive than rambling on about some topic or the other. I just don't know that I am that person.
Definitely.
And I was super scared to do recording and put something out there. That was the fear that I had. But we through conversations, we had eventually come up with that idea that it'd be started. It was at Constantia, Constantia at our last walk. That was the birth of the podcast. Was like, okay, well, if we do storytelling and we do it together, because I think it ended up being, I was still being a bit cagey, and then you said, okay, but then what if we do it together? And then I said, well, then that changes everything, because if we do it as a collective, then it actually feels a lot better.
No, exactly. And obviously part of the gift of the stories, it's not just been your and my stories, which we do have quite a lot of, and they're also quite different. We have quite different upbringings and socialized in different ways. But part of the beauty of it is also listening to other people's stories. That's, I guess, been the main intention in not episode 1, but from episodes 2 to 6. And to me, that has been, it's been an unexpected gift, genuinely. Listening to people. I've said to you just in a couple of times that, like, I think I've listened to the podcast the most. Unofficial listens, because they are before it's released, but it's because I edit it. So there's been so many things that I've heard our guests, different people say, which have really, really deeply impacted me. And like I said, I'll maybe hear someone say something 10 times. So even the way they said it will be in my dreams when I'm sleeping, in my subconscious. And I've been actually, again, surprisingly so blessed to be really impacted by hearing different people's stories and lived experiences of their realities and of their work in the city in Cape Town. So that's been beautiful. I don't know about you, maybe have you felt something similar?
What I'm now thinking about as you're speaking, part of this episode is about interweaving our story into that collection of stories that we've now had over the last while. And in the beginning of the podcast, we had this conversation about how do we integrate our stories into this grander story as well of being in the city. And we've tried to include little bits of that in each episode, saying a little bit about ourselves and things. But I think at the end of season 1, my takeaway or my personal learnings from doing the podcast, not necessarily what each episode, the topics that were discussed, although there's a lot there that impacted me, similar to what you're describing. The thing for me was, in the beginning of the year, every year, my birthday's in January, and I like to set an intention for the year.
Go to like gym, 1st of January.
I don't do resolutions like that, because then you just drop out by the end of January.
First week,
by the first week of January. But I tried to set an intention of some kind.
That's cool.
For this year, my intention was, and I wrote it down, was something about do things even when I'm afraid. And so when we spoke about doing this podcast, and I was afraid that wouldn't be a blocker. That was already a commitment I'd made to myself. So I couldn't use being fearful as an excuse. It was like, okay, cool, I'm scared, but almost it doesn't matter. We'll do it anyway. And we did it. And that for me feels like also pushing a boundary, pushing the threshold of what's possible. All the kinds of things that people are talking about in their own stories that we've interviewed this season, that feels like it resonates with me, that stepping outside of your comfort zone sometimes is good.
That's cool.
Or stepping into that liminal space filled with fear and a void that way it feels like there's nothing there, but actually hanging out there is good sometimes.
So one other important aspect of the early days of the podcast was coming up with a name for it, which obviously, as we all know by now, we landed on the Liminal Space. Tristan, you actually came up with that name. Do you remember at the time why it stuck with you? And perhaps as we've had these conversations, if there's been anything that you've seen the value of having conversations in liminal spaces.
So I can't remember the exact moment or when exactly the liminal space as a thing. I believe we actually first said the liminal place was the first idea, and then it became the liminal
we forgot
space.
that was
I think we just forgot it, then it became the liminal space. But what I was thinking about at the time, and in our conversations that we were having over the many months, that were not necessarily podcast related, they were just conversations we'd have, was this idea of not being sure, being unsure, and that being okay, that like mystery and uncertainty and questioning things, those kinds of themes kept coming up. And what had become important for me was a processing space, a place where you don't have to hold onto things too tightly, that you can change your mind, that you could learn new things. So I was grappling with what is a word that describes that. And I believe I heard about liminality first from Barry Lewis, who was on the podcast, because he used to speak, Barry, when he speaks about something, he speaks about it a lot if he becomes convinced about something. And he had spoken about liminality in his work and some of the stuff that he was doing. But I thought that the liminal space is a good concept to describe all of those things that I was feeling. And in a way, it does describe, other people call it threshold spaces. There's like this idea of threshold spaces in spirituality, or thin spaces as well as another word, where they're all spaces in between. They're all in between two worlds, two places, two things, two states of being. So thin places can be between the spiritual realm and the physical realm, that kind of idea. And so the word liminal seemed to be fitting, and that was exactly it. It captured all of those kinds of ideas.
That's really cool. And I'm wondering, maybe for both of us, one thing we do talk about a lot is like religion, specifically Christianity. We maybe didn't talk about it that much in all the episodes, but there is one thing that we talk about as well. I think about how, especially like a Western imagination of Christianity, it's often about being sure. You must be sure, you must be the whole thing of, you must have like a 2-minute testimony and a 30-second testimony. And the whole thing is you must be ready in and out of season. If someone asks you a question, you need to have an answer and you need to know and explain. And if you don't, it's almost seen as like a bad thing, like perhaps a lack of faith or a lack of knowledge about God, or about, I don't know, could be the scriptures or something like that. And you were speaking about this idea of a threshold, and a liminal space also being this notion of like a pathway between two spaces, so that thin space between two spaces. So I'm wondering, perhaps part of why for you and I, and maybe other people as well, we are tired of being sure about everything and being experts and those kind of things, is because we've actually been socialized in places which have told us you need to be experts and you need to be sure and whatever. And I think that can be very tiring, because it paints itself as being good and beautiful and amazing. I think it leaves very little room for things like mystery and questions as well. It leaves very little room for questions. And I think that asking questions and leaning into uncertainty is actually such a beautiful thing, because it opens up different possibilities. Now we perhaps start talking about imagination and reimagining things, or imagining new sets of possibilities. That is only possible, at least in my opinion, if we can admit we actually don't have everything together. For example, if we think of the world, or even just our city, to not say, wow, Cape Town is a beautiful space. We know that because it was on the top places to travel list, or most beautiful places to travel list. But to actually perhaps step away from that narrative and actually be in another space that may also be uncomfortable, but I think it's honest and it's authentic, and it also longs for something more.
Yeah, maybe that's a good word of like it's an honest space.
Yeah.
Because I think part of what happened maybe for both of us, I think, I'm presuming now, so you can disagree with me, but what's happened for both of us is listening to people that we respect and admire who was very sure. They were very sure about various different things. And for me, when I looked behind the surface, I was like, oh, but this is not based on much. And actually some of the things were untrue. And so there's also a distrust in someone who's absolutely sure about everything, because there are just some things that are unknowable about being a human being, I think. So in some ways we left with this process. All we left with is this processing space, the making sense of things in between things, rather than being in a certain state one way or the other all the time, you know.
That's cool. And I was thinking that perhaps part of maybe those pathways towards something different would be things like, for example, listening to your body. I think of our conversation with Tammy and Zach. And we were talking about how we have this head knowledge, and how that's also how most of us have been socialized to trust our minds before we trust our bodies or anything like that. So I wonder if perhaps part of the conversations of being in a liminal space or a transitional space, or however you define it, is peeling back these layers and actually seeing, wow, there's actually different ways that we can be, that we can belong. And listening to people's stories and, like I said, their experiences as humans on Earth, I think that's such a gift, because we're able to see or hear other glimpses of things, and they can, I think, help us long for something more, something better.
What is also interesting is in the beginning we spoke about, because both of us identify somewhat with the Christian tradition, although we in episode 2 we were talking about how that might be different, but we never set out to do a religious podcast necessarily. It just so happens that and maybe the crowd of people we've gathered, when we asked them the question about the stories that ground them, they went back to religion or childhood things, even if they've now moved on. And so that was interesting for me, that the people's faith bases shone through, even if they had left it behind, that was something that still was formative for them, and somehow formed them, and they're still talking about it now. Which is why it matters. I think it matters what we teach kids, and what we how do we come to believe, how do we come to know, that idea that you spoke about now, about different ways of knowing. Like, it's a deep and important question about how do we know, and how do we decide when we know something, you know.
And I was gonna maybe ask a question as well, which would be, why should we have different ways of knowing? Why should there be different ways of being? If I had to ask you that question, perhaps maybe grounding it in the context of Cape Town. Why do we need different things? Maybe even thinking of some of the things Barry was talking about, different ways of thinking about home and creating home. Why do we need that?
I think we need it because no one person can see the full picture, or no one ideology. Now I'm going to sound like I'm a universalist or whatever. But I think there's something about a beauty, and not in a corny way about diversity, but in difference. Not like that, not rainbow nation vibes or whatever. But I think there's a genuine and legit amazingness about having different lenses and different views to see the full picture. And with the complexity in the world being what it is, and the complexities around Cape Town being what it is, and the many different ways people navigate Cape Town, I think it is important to have these different ways of knowing as well, different ways of seeing.
And one other thing we spoke about early on was this idea of Cape Town, the city, being a liminal space.
Yes, we did.
Have you had any reflections on that? Maybe hearing the stories, maybe hearing different things?
I don't know. I'm not sure how much of that came through in how we spoke about the city of Cape Town. There's definitely what came through was there's different versions of the city of Cape Town that we can choose to believe or change or reject. But Cape Town as a liminal, but Cape Town as an in-between space. Maybe it's a little less comfortable now, because it is an in-between space in that we said, I think we said it's an in-between space because it could become better, and we don't accept the current state that it's in. So maybe that is the best way to describe it, as a liminal space.
Yeah.
But it is uncomfortable to think about the good parts of Cape Town existing at the expense of other parts that are underfunded and disregarded by the powerful and the wealthy.
Yeah. I would perhaps think about how Cape Town has been imagined and then formed and created in a certain way. And how, I mean, you see a lot of people in this day and age either being in a bubble and just assuming that everyone has the same experience living in Cape Town. Either you want to be in that bubble and stay in the bubble, or actually saying, can we actually imagine something different that's actually good for everyone? And perhaps one idea for me of liminality which stands out is thinking of it as a pathway. We've spoken a few times over the conversations about how sometimes we'll look at something like the city, maybe when we get out of those bubbles, and we actually acknowledge things are actually not okay. There's so much suffering and oppression, and sometimes, like we've spoke about before, how you can be almost paralyzed in a moment, or paralyzed in our lives. So what I think we often need in these kind of instances are pathways towards imagining something better. And one definition of liminality or of liminal spaces is this idea of, you spoke about like transitional spaces. Classically, it could be like a passage. So say, for example, you have two rooms and you're in one room, and you don't really focus on that passage. You just walk through that passage and then you get to the next room, and it's more about the rooms. But just thinking about how, if we're saying, using the metaphor of two rooms, and we're in one room, which is the status quo, which is, I don't know if there's any other ways you would define it.
Yeah, I'd say the status quo. Things the way they are
Things the way they are.
Yeah.
In Cape Town, like I was saying, the city's been imagined in a certain way. It's a colonially imagined city with spatial apartheid. That is the status quo. So we need a pathway towards something different. We can't just break this room down and get into a new room magically. There's no teleportation in real life. We actually need a passage or a pathway into that other room. And I think about perhaps the beauty of storytelling on those pathways, that they help us know which direction we must actually walk in, so we're not going back into the status quo room, for example. I think about also the value of walking together on that pathway, so that it's not an individual thing. That's been so beautiful for me. People who have different ideas about life and literally different religions in some instances, and we actually long for the same things. We long to see the same things. So we can all journey together on a pathway towards something better. You know?
Do you think there were moments on the podcast that people gave us those pathways, like hints at those pathways, that how we could potentially, even if it wasn't the exact work that they are doing, but that they gave us ways of navigating those pathways?
I think navigating the pathways, but also giving what we've spoken about a few times, even in the intro of episode 1, about these gaps in reality or glimpses of something better. And in every single episode, in every single conversation, there was something that I heard, or many things that I heard, that for me was a gap in reality, or a glimpse for something better. I would perhaps maybe think about it as hope. Hope is not something we necessarily talk about that much, and hope is also something that, it's been an interesting thing, because I wrote a song quite a few years ago about hope. I haven't released it yet. I will one day. We'll get there. But
you heard it here first.
You heard it here first. It's a song that meant quite a lot to me. So I've often been sitting with this idea of hope, and I think in a lot of spaces that I've been socialized in, maybe I won't name those spaces, but hope can be quite like this airy fairy concept, and it's can often be more about escapism. So that hope is defined as like, basically escaping our bodies and going into the clouds. And then it's like, we have hope. Maybe if it's in a Christian context or a different religious context, it's like we have hope that one day things will be better. But I'm really thinking about this idea, and in these conversations we've had with people, thinking about how can hope be realized. I think even with Ashley and Helene, we spoke about critical hope. How can hope be realized where we actually are staying in our bodies? And we acknowledge that it's not helpful for me to escape my body because my neighbor's body, my neighbor themselves are suffering. So I actually need to remain so that I can be present and I can hold their hand and be with them in that moment. So there were lots of those glimpses that I saw. Would you maybe, I know I guess I define them as hope. Is there any other word you'd maybe use?
Imagination is a word that comes to mind. So unlocking imagination, like imagined futures, different alternative imagined futures for the city, for people. One of the ideas now that you're speaking about is collectivism. Even like, can we think about hope not as an individual thing? Even like maybe that only exists together. I think more and more the world, we see in the world that we are completely connected and absolutely reliant on everybody. So a new imagination for Cape Town, for the world, is that it's a together, some kind of togetherness, that our humanity is bound up with one another. We can't escape that. That's become evident over the last couple of years with all the big crises the world faces.
Exactly.
And so I think these liminal spaces present opportunities for imagination to happen. So we framed it in the beginning about storytelling is also where that happens. So in the stories that we tell, we find hope, we find imagination, we find that's actually the work that I think we need to be doing more of. And so that's, I mean, maybe that's why we did the podcast to begin with, in a rather, now that I'm thinking about it, as we're talking about how we did things, it was in a haphazard kind of way. We stumbled upon this in a way. We didn't plan it to be this way, but we found something that's quite beautiful and life-giving to us personally, and hopefully to others as well. But we had spoken about the podcast room or the podcast space itself being a liminal space, that I believe something happens in the recording when we're actually doing the conversation. There's often something happening there, like whether it be us as individuals learning or our guests recounting some of their own stories and realizing and remembering some stuff that they'd forgotten and things like that. It's quite beautiful, and I'm happy that I said yes, despite being afraid, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so that's it for season 1.
Yeah.
That was really great.
Nice.
So we're going to take a short break to gather our breath, which won't be very long. And then we'll come back with season 2 with some new
conversations, new stories.
Yeah.
And just before we end, we also wanted to ask if anyone has any thoughts and feedback. We'd love to hear from you. Feel free to DM us on the Instagram page or on our personal accounts or anything like that. It would just be beautiful to hear from you, whatever that is, whether it's critical feedback and helpful feedback or anything like that. It will be beautiful.
So thank you for listening, and I hope you join us again. Fun.
You want to do an altar call?
Maybe to end we can do an altar call.
I think so. Okay. 5